Hello and good evening, everyone, or at least good evening here in London, where we're broadcasting to you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and it's a great pleasure to introduce the rest of our panel on this event on classical contemporary in conversation with Francesco Vezzoli. My name is Michael Squire. I teach at King's College London, and this event is a collaboration between the Centre for Hellenic Studies at King's and the Brescia Museums. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Brescia in just a moment, and talk about how this is a project that links together our academic interests at King's with the curatorial concerns of that particular museum. At this stage, I'm going to see if I can use the wonders of PowerPoint to get my PowerPoint up on the screen, and just bear with me a second. Hopefully everyone can see some pictures on the screen if you're watching at home. And I'm going to introduce a little bit about what we're going to be talking about tonight and the particular curatorial context. This is an event called In Conversation with Francesco Vezzoli because it takes its lead, its kind of anchor, is the particular show on at Brescia at the moment on archaeological stages. It's a show in which Vezzoli doubles up as both curator and artist, installing into the archaeological space of the UNESCO registered site 8 different sculptures and multimedia pieces that exist in dialogue with the archaeological and art historical pieces of the museum. I should say outright that I feel a bit of a fraud talking about this particular exhibition because due to the restrictions of the pandemic, I, along with some of the other panel, haven't actually seen these pieces in person. And so I'm hugely grateful to Francesco and his studio, as well as to the Brescia Museum, for all of their help explaining the rationale behind the exhibition and its particular programme. As I said, this is a collaboration between our interests at King's, because at King's we have a project on modern classicisms that explores precisely the dialogues between classical Greco-Roman art and the modern cultural imaginary. In 2018, we had our own show bringing together the work of some 60 artists, where works by modern 20th and 21st century artists were displayed in parallel with Greco-Roman antiquities. So this is a project close to my own heart. The particular spur for the Brescia Museum, though, was the restoration of the very famous winged Victory of Brescia, which was restored in Florence for 3 years and which was returned to the museum some 3 years ago. And as a result, the Brescia Museums received generous funding from the Italian Council, which has helped with the particular show. Now, Francesco is going to be much better at talking about his particular installations than I am, and the point of this exercise is really to hear Francesco's views on some of the larger questions we want to raise. But before handing over to him and to the rest of the panel, I just wanted to give you a very quick visual overview of his particular installations. Now, one of the important things about the Archaeological Stages show is the way in which the visitor traverses some multi-millennia of history, from the Republican sanctuary of Brescia all the way through to the later Lombard frescoes and the museums of the site. Were I to be doing this properly, I would follow the chronological order of the installations, but I'm going to leave that to Francesco to talk about in person and just give you a quick overview of the 8 statues that you can see below. I call them statues, but I think the multimedial nature of these installations is hugely important. The way in which we have antiquities that are physically reworked, in fact, in a kind of late 18th century tradition of restoration, of direct intervention with these antiquities, displayed alongside decidedly modern and contemporary pieces. I guess, you know, we talked a little bit about the Winged Victory of Brescia. One of the landmark installations is the one outside on the Capitolium with its copy of the Victory of Samothrace and its large replacement head in good Italian Decarico kind of tradition. That kind of Chirico takes us to other sorts of installations by Francesco, including his statue of Sophia Loren. And I think we can instantly see here how the cult of personality, the cult of icons, is looming large. One of the things that really interests me about Francesco's work is the way in which we have the old and the new decidedly placed alongside each other, asking all sorts of questions about the relationship between what's so often called high and low culture, but also the relationship between the classical and the pop. And pop culture kind of looms large here, I think. And one of the things that really interests me about this show is the way in which antiquity becomes a kind of a cinematic set, a cinematic playground, a kind of Cinecittà, if you like, for all manner of Francesco's scenographic installations. The cult of personality takes us to other pieces in the show too, including this bronze work with the head of Kim Kardashian. You'll instantly see that while the statue takes its inspiration from a so-called Venus, it's not a Greco-Roman Venus, but in fact the Venus of Willendorf, one of the oldest figurative statues known to us, on display in Vienna, of course, but here transformed into a colossal kind of installation. The multimedial nature of these installations can be demonstrated by other pieces too. Take this Republican style statue with the bronze head atop. But one of the things that also interests me about Francesco's work is his use of polychrome, his use of colour. Of course, a major theme for archaeological research, especially archaeological teams work about Francesco's work, is his direct intervention on antiquities, his direct work on the actual objects rather than plaster cast. And again, that's something I'm really interested to hear Francesco talk about. This is a statue, the gaze of Hadrian, but of course with painted eyes and face. And likewise, this is a neoclassical Achilles, but turned into a kind of Twiggy, if you like, of 20th century pop. I told you that pop and classical loom large in a tensional dialogue in all of Francesco's work. Paint looms large in other of these installations too, but here you can also see the multimedial nature of the work, where different materials are brought together in one and the same piece. And again, I was going to end with this piece. I told you I was taking these out of chronological order. One of the things that really interests me about this piece, with its head in the body of the statue down below, is the way in which we have a statue quite literally looking backwards and forwards. And it's that kind of two-way gaze, I think, that really interests me about Francesco's work. As I said, I just wanted to begin with some of those installations to set the visual scene using PowerPoint. As I've said, we're hugely grateful to Francesco, but we're also grateful to the rest of our panel. And you can see here how we're going to proceed for the remainder of our hour today. We've got 4 speakers after Francesco himself, and in a minute I'm going to hand over to Francesco. And we've got Salvatore Settis, formerly director of the Getty Center in Los Angeles, but also formerly director of the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa. And we're hugely grateful to Salvatore for bringing his expertise, not only as an archaeologist and art historian, but also as someone really interested in the contemporary Italian art scene. We're then going to move on to Verity Platt, Professor of Classics and Art History at Cornell, and then move on to Patrick Crowley, now at Stanford University, Associate Curator of European Art, and then finally on to Letizia Ragaglia in Liechtenstein, but speaking to us tonight from Turin. So we've got a truly global setup from California through to New York, all the way to Italy and beyond. And I want to take this opportunity to say how grateful we are to all of the speakers for joining us tonight and making this work. I should say that Francesco, there's always a technical hitch when we use Microsoft Teams. And Francesco is going to be talking to us tonight as a headless icon. So you're going to be able to hear him, but not see him. And I think that's a really nice kind of irony for someone so interested in iconic pop culture, that we're going to hear his voice, but not see him directly. So Francesco, is it all right if I hand straight on over to you?
Yes. Thank you so much for your words. I hope everyone can hear me good, and I do apologize for the technical problems. I swear they were not my fault. And the first thing I would like to say is that I have never been on such a high scale, high level. I mean, this is the highest level of academic group of people I've ever had in my life speaking about my work. So I'm extremely flattered. Thanks to Salvatore Settis and to everyone else in the group. I hope you can hear me good.
Yes.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes, no problem.
Perfect. Allora, since Michael has already said things about my works, and I presume the others in one way or another will too, I would like to bring to the panel, so to say, a personal perspective, which I think is the best and the only thing I can genuinely do. What strikes me is that this panel, this conference, do tie together the two most important cities in my life: the city where I was born, Brescia, and the city where I discovered life, which is London. After I finished a classical high school, I decided that I needed a break. I was deeply fascinated by all forms of culture and counterculture and all things London, and so I did apply for Central St. Martin. I was lucky. I got a place for a BA in fine arts, and that did change my life. What I would like to say is that when it comes to this approach, to this contemporary approach to classicism, whenever they say to me, "Oh, it's so contemporary," it makes me smile. Whenever they say it's so modern, it makes me smile. I just think classicity is present in our life. When I was an adolescent student in Brescia, and this links very directly to the contemporary art debate right now, which is so much about identity and inclusivity. I must say that maybe I was in love with my own hometown, Brescia, but maybe I didn't feel so welcomed by the social environment. And on the contrary, it was my classical studies, both literary and artistic, that for several reasons made me feel somehow accepted, or they gave me great energy, and this evidently has not gone lost in my sensibility, since then at some point of my path I decided to go back to all that iconography and bring it back into my work. So I have got nothing. Yes, I could speak about the ways of restorations and the notion of pastiche and all these things where other people are much bigger experts than me. All I can say and underline is that either Apollo, Euriolo, Eniso, Sappho, Catullo, the tales of Agrippina and Messalina and the emperors and Caligula, etc., etc., etc. All those things made me a happier, a more curious, a more active person, and my contemporary, my artworks today are just a give back to something that has given to me so much in my youth and in my adolescence. And I think this is the most personal thing I can say, and then I leave to the others the more serious observations. Thanks so much to everyone for being here.
Thank you, Francesco. And at this stage, let me say that while we're going to have some short discussions by the panel to begin with, Francesco and the rest of the panel are going to be available to answer questions. If you're watching this at home and watching it live, you should see in your screen a question that gets fed through to us. And in the last 20 minutes of tonight's discussion, I will put those questions directly to the panel. So although I'm not going to take questions directly after each person's initial speech, at any stage, please do type in your questions, and then we will come up to them in the last 20 minutes. If, like me, you find yourself technically challenged with Microsoft Teams, you can always fall back on email. And I've put there at the bottom of the screen my email address, which I'll be checking for the remainder of our session. And again, just drop your questions to me by email and I'll put them to the panel. Before proceeding, I should also say that we're going to be using Francesco's art here to ask some larger questions too, about how classical art can speak to contemporary art, can shed light on contemporary concerns, but also how contemporary concerns can illuminate new perspectives on antiquity. So we're going to be very much with that dialogue in mind as we proceed through the next 4 short presentations. So without more of ado then, let me hand over to Salvatore, and hopefully through the magic of Microsoft Teams, if I put on the next slide, hopefully now you can see Salvatore appear in the lower right of your screens.
That's fine. Thank you, Michael. Let me start by a very simple, apparently, a very simple question. Is it ever possible to trigger a conversation between classical art and contemporary world? What we are seeing here on the screen is a Roman statue in white marble, a copy after Polycletus Doryphorus, which was originally in bronze, shown together with a bronze reconstruction of the lost original dated about 1910 and made by a German archaeologist. So what we see here is a sort of mise en abîme, an archaeological reconstruction based upon a Roman copy, which in turn is based upon a Greek original, different, divergent temporalities. Next slide, please. Next. So museums of classical art frequently open their doors to contemporary artists, as it happens in Brescia now. In a 2015 exhibition at the Prada Foundation in Milan, I adopted a different approach, which I would like to focus on for a minute. I tried to articulate a visual conversation around a contemporary category, seriality, within a contemporary building by Rem Koolhaas, but showing only works of classical art. Next, please. Next slide. So Rem Koolhaas also designed the installation where the interaction between sculptures and architectures were very important. And you can see also the shadow of the Discobolus lost original close to a copy of it. Next slide, please. The seriality of classical art was evidenced through examples like this one, 4 identical copies after a Greek original found together in a Roman villa, i.e. seriality displayed as such by ancient collectors. Next, please. At the same time, we did a twin exhibition at the Fondazione Prada in Venice, again with Rem, on portable classic, i.e. seriality plus reduced size, as shown next by several copies. No, there was one missing in between. Okay, for some reason one disappeared. So let me move on. The reconstructions of lost originals by classical archaeologists inevitably incorporate elements and trends of taste contemporary to them. First example, dated 1910, I already mentioned it, is the bronze reconstruction of the Doryphorus by a German archaeologist, including blonde hair of the bronze and other colored details. Second example, next slide, dated 1991, an Apollo probably by Phidias, a copy, a Roman copy was experimentally shown in Kassel, where it belongs, with two plaster casts, one of which covered with a gilded metal leaf. So a totally different reconstruction, totally different idea of bronze polychromy in classical antiquity, made by another German archaeologist, 1991. Third and last example, next, dated 2015, a bronze reconstruction of one of the Riace bronzes made by other German archaeologists with their very rich polychromy. And next slide, in the exhibition, in the Syria Classic exhibition, it was possible to see in close proximity 3 different archaeological reconstructions of the appearance of a lost 5th century BC Greek original, made respectively in 1910, 1991, 2015, invariably by different German archaeologists with divergent conceptions of classical art, diverging aesthetic taste. The next, please. The same is true of the increasingly popular experiments in reconstructing classical polychromy, either in Greece, left in Munich, or in Rome, right at Vatican museums. Yet, these experiments are invariably made on casts made in our own time, while for a classical archaeologist, painting directly on an ancient marble would be unthinkable. Last slide, please. But this is apparently exactly what Francesco Vezzoli did on some ancient pieces such as this, with Hadrian's gaze added to the marble in a sort of polychromy that is almost as if in needlepoint, which is an artistic technique of Francesco practiced extensively. So the question I'd like to finish with is this a pop version of the archaeological research on polychromy, or rather what Francesco in another context called a slittamento dispettoso, translated as mischievous shift away from the regular archaeological practice? And what is the relationship? Is there any relationship between needlepoint and archaeology? King Gustav Adolf VI of Sweden knew about it because he was doing needlework while excavating Etruscan tombs. So my question is about different strategies of addressing our conversation with classical antiquity, and of course, my question is mainly for the artist himself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. It's a question we will save to put to Francesco until the discussion. I'm going to move straight on to Verity, speaking to us from Cornell. Verity, can you hear us all right?
I'm envious of those of you who can see the Brescia show in person. I was lucky to see Francesco's installation in the Il Classico si fa pop exhibition in Rome, in dialogue with the collections of the Palazzo Massimo, but I would love to witness his sculptures in conversation with ancient architecture, the archaeological stages or institutional and civic performance spaces of the Capitolium, Forum, Theatre or Basilica. Mixing the high and low, eternal solemnity and irreverent pop, classical statuary and modernist metaphysics, his interventions open up a dialogue between past and present that is not simply about receiving and reworking the classical tradition, but activates short circuits or folds that allow a genuine collaboration between the ancient and contemporary. As I'm beaming in from the USA, though, I thought that instead of a superficial analysis of work I cannot see in person, today I might offer a comparison from New York State, where I am a resident. Although they differ in important ways, I would like to invite you to explore the parallels and contrasts between the Brescia exhibition and a recent installation in Manhattan by the African-American artist Sanford Biggers. Could we go to the next slide? Like Francesco, Biggers draws on classical statuary, creating new hybrid forms that combine the relics of antiquity with other traditions in playful and irreverent ways. In the context of the contemporary USA, however, they demonstrate how any engagement with classicism is inseparable from an intense conversation about race. Biggers' 2021 installation in the Rockefeller Center in New York points to some trends worth drawing out in contemporary receptions of classicism. The centerpiece was a 25-foot bronze sculpture named Oracle, which, like other hybrid pieces in a series he calls Chimera, that's next slide, combines a classical body, in this case one redolent of Phidias's Zeus at Olympia, with a head that draws on the traditions of African masks and figurines. Here you see examples from a related exhibition featuring classical Venus types in marble. And then could we go back to the previous slide? The throne of Oracle features reliefs of lotus blossoms, their petals simultaneously cross sections of slave ships. In addition, the statue included an interactive element whereby viewers could consult a digital oracle featuring gnomic comments voiced by celebrities. So briefly, I'd like to invite you to consider the following ideas. And I'd love to hear what Francesco has to say about these too. First, any contemporary engagement with classicism in public space requires a destabilizing of traditions around monumentality. In Biggers' case, the simultaneous whitewashing of classical statuary and the blackwashing of visual traditions associated with the African diaspora. Second, the built environment provides civic stages on which this reckoning with the classical tradition can be performed. Like the theatre in Brescia, the Rockefeller Center is concerned with broadcasting, in this case through the mass media of the 20th century, radio and television. Third, civic spaces have themselves been shaped by multiple receptions of antiquity, which influence contemporary engagements in turn, whether De Chirico's metaphysical metamorphoses of the Roman arcade in the Brescia exhibition, or 1930s Art Deco reimaginings of the public forum with all its associated mythologies, in the case of the Rockefeller Center, where Biggers' Oracle is juxtaposed with Lee Laurie's Bronze Atlas and Paul Manship's Gilded Prometheus. Fourth, Roman games with the relationship between sculpted heads and bodies, combined with the fragmentation of ancient sculpture in the archaeological record, facilitates chimerical experimentation, allowing for dissonant juxtapositions of style, medium, and iconography. How these dissonances play out depends on local context and the personal interests of the artist, and here Vezzoli and Biggers are doing very different things. But the impulse to play with hybridity is, one might say, actively encouraged by ancient sculpture itself. Lastly, the confluence of public space, civic and commercial institutions, monumentality and classicism is impossible at this moment in time to separate from highly politicized questions of identity. The question of who gets to play with antiquity, how and where they get to display their work, and how audiences engage with it is fundamentally one of power, access, and resources. Biggers is one of several Black artists engaging with the classical tradition, whose work is now being invited into public spaces in the USA and UK as part of a larger reckoning with historical racism. I think also of Kara Walker, Kahinda Wiley, and Simone Lee, who'll be representing the USA at the Venice Biennale next year. I leave you with one final example. That's next slide. Thank you. Albeit rather different in tone. This is Witness, a monumental bronze by the Black British artist Thomas J. Price, which is currently on show in a public park in Harlem, also in New York City. This too is an intervention upon a civic stage, but one that rejects hybrid forms, looking instead to the dignity, interiority, and self-sufficiency of classical statuary in order to make a claim for groups that have long been denied such privileges in the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verity. We're going to come back to lots of those themes in the discussion. But for now, let's move straight on from New York to California. And Patch, can you hear us all right?
I can. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. Thanks again to everybody here. And I'm keeping this a little bit more casual, but I just wanted to begin, first of all, maybe just a thought for later for the Q&A, but I really appreciated Francesco's kind of, musings on the sort of presence of classicity. And this is something I've just been thinking about here as the sort of, as an American in this context and thinking about these different kinds of kind of national contexts. And it also feels a little funny to me in a way to be kind of thinking about Francesco's work in this context, because I confess I had always sort of thought about it in terms, and I hope this is fair, as a kind of parodic performance in a way of academic and museological claims to knowledge in a way. So sort of what Salvatore was saying before about the sort of mischievousness of Francesco's work. Mike, if you could go to the next slide. So an image that we've already seen a couple of times, but polygamy for me is really one of the things that I've been most interested in Francesco's work. And here, in the one case that is in the Brescia show, but there are other examples in Francesco's work. I brought in just 2 other slides. But here, you're right, with the gaze of Hadrian, right, sort of opening these eyes as if it's like opening the eyes of a death mask or something, with these kinds of, flashy, lurid gaze of Hadrian, sort of imagining, Antinous lurking sort of somewhere behind us. And, the sort of tradition of polygamy, right, in the most kind of contemporary context with which many of us are familiar, especially since the early 2000s with Vincent Brinkmann and others who have been doing these, historical reconstructions or evidence-based hypotheses or mock-ups, if you want, that make competing claims to historical authenticity and scientific objectivity. Some of them, as Salvatore mentioned, on casts, but many of them actually on the marble to try to approximate as closely as possible the ancient effect. But one of the most interesting things to me is that we've actually known about polygamy for a very long time. Right, at least since the 18th century, and at least since the 19th century, there were many debates going on, especially with Gottfried Semper and others, about architectural elements and so forth. And so there's this kind of recurring historical amnesia, which I find to be really interesting at play with polygamy as well. Ways in which, right, we are often see, right, in the popular press, right, these headlines of, did you know that ancient statues were painted? And we hear about this kind of over and over again in a way that's understandable, because in a way it's sort of, to see these new polychrome reconstructions kind of violates what the Viennese art historian Alois Riegel had identified at the turn of the 20th century as the age value of antiquities, right? To see them in their imperfect, unconserved state. And so what interests me about the way that Francesco is using polygamy is how it kind of, queers time in a way, right? Thinking about what Elizabeth Freeman has called chrononormativity, but also kind of, if I may, sort of queering the very kinds of forensic methods, right, that archaeologists use to study these objects. If we can go just to the next slide for a moment. I was particularly drawn, one of the first things that I saw Francesco's work at Teatro Romano at the at PS1 at MoMA, and right, these heads, which I eventually located on various Christie's lots. But what I was really attracted to was the way in which Francesco, not only we're not seeing things in historical reconstructions of objectivity per se, even though there is a kind of, he appropriates the discourse of that, right, in the presentation of the show, which I find fascinating. But here, right, for me at least, seeing someone like Angelina Jolie, for example, her arched eyebrows, which, it's both pop, but I think it's actually doing something really interesting with sculptural aesthetics, right? The way in which the eyebrow doesn't follow the brow line, right? That it just goes above. It's really uncoupling, or it's doing something different with the sort of subordination of color to form, right, that we thought about ever since the 18th and 19th centuries, right, that I think is making, both, a sort of camp and almost sort of drag performance of classicity in a way, but is also doing something really, I think, smart with 18th and 19th century aesthetics. We could go to the next slide too. Even using, this is one of my sort of recent favorites of this Roman lady made up to be Joan Allen, even using black and white paint. And I couldn't help but think of, and I don't have time to talk about it here, but Pleasantville with Joan Allen, with Tobey Maguire adding, right, the gray makeup to her to conceal the fact that she is in fact in color. So one way of wrapping this up is that one thing that I think polychromy is really interesting to think about is in terms of, what did the ancients see when they actually looked at these sculptures in the past? And historians and philosophers of science, raise the question of, can you have an experience of something without the concept of it? And we often, people often talk about, for example, that the ancient Greeks are curiously kind of silent about what we see as the color blue, for example. This is a famous case. So can the ancient Greeks have an experience of seeing blue if they don't have the concept of seeing blue? So it kind of raises all these interesting questions. If we were teleported into the past, would we be seeing the same things, even if we're looking at physically and materially identical objects? So in a way, I guess, there's a funny sort of alignment between Vezzoli's polychromy and sort of, let's say, Brinkmann's or other classical archaeologists' polychromy. And that's to say that if, scientific reconstructions of polychromy aim at something almost like a sort of Brechtian techniques of defamiliarization, right? That is to say, trying to make the classical uncanny or strange. It seems to me, at least, that Francesco's polychromy does something different, right? That it offers a kind of reparative invitation to imagine, right? Through humor, through pleasure, through curiosity, that bridges historical distance, not by merely filling in missing limbs or lost color, but in a kind of radical empathy, if we can think about it that way. So I'll end there and leave it to Letizia.
Thanks very much, Pat. Letizia, should we move straight over to you? Can you hear us all right?
So I invited Francesco to, he had at disposal the whole museum in Bolzano 5 years ago. There was one show of sculptures which had a little bit a similar concept and atmosphere to the one of Brescia. But there was another show where Francesco Vezzoli was the curator of part of the museum collection. And I would like to deepen a little bit this show because, in my opinion, it gives also an idea of how Francesco deals with time. And I would start with a quote of Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. And he has often stressed how lively a relationship with the past can facilitate an access to the present. He says, contemporariness is then a singular relationship with one's one time, which adheres to it and at the same time keeps distance from it. More precisely, it's that relationship with time that adheres to it through disjunction and an anachronism. So Francesco Vezzoli has always been in a continuous dialogue with history. He has himself has said that this confrontation has been a full confrontation. He has delved into the story of antiquity, of cinema, of image, of power. And I think that, as Agamben said, he was able to introduce into time an essential inhomogeneity. Therefore, for me, and not only for me, Francesco is first of all a conceptual artist. And at the very beginning of his career, he used embroidery as a conceptual scheme. And it allowed this embroidery, allowed him to appropriate other works and languages. At Museum, he used another tool, the tool of the frame. And maybe we can also already start with the first slide, because what he did, is to establish an interaction between part of the museum collection and frames of masterpieces of the history of art. Please note that the frames are not wooden or metallic frames, but they are painted in trompe-l'oeil. We also did a publication, and Dieter Rollstratte was one of the authors of the catalogue, and he quoted Derrida and saying how ambiguous is the status of the frame in the Western aesthetic tradition. The frame points out, where does the artwork begin? Where does it end? So Francesco Vezzoli rose these questions through the reframing. Is the frame excluding, including? And what he also did is to think about the audience, but I will arise this a little bit later. Here you have an example of a female portrait by the Tyrolese artist Ernst Nepo, and the frame is one of the portraits of, always a female portrait, that of Jean-Auguste Ingres. And the next slide, please. Here you have a photograph by Mangolding. It's Gina at Bruce's dinner party. And the frame is of St. Jerome, located in the Galleria Borghese by Caravaggio. So you can see the photograph. There is a poster of Caravaggio. There is a fruit basket. So sometimes the associations are very evident. Sometimes they are more hidden. And I think that also the fact that the frames are painted, are a trompe-l'oeil, does underline also this emotional aspect of the frame. And this is, in my opinion, also the inclusion of the audience of Francesco. He always plays with this emotion. Next frame, next slide. And here you have an Austrian artist, Hans Staudacher, and there is a frame by David. Then next slide. Here you can have an overview. Francesco divided the show into portraits, into abstract paintings, and also still lifes. Here we have an overview. On the left you see a Carla Cardi, and then in the middle you have an Emilio Vedova. So these are all works of the collection with these very prestigious frames. Then there was only one, there were some paintings which were not framed. Maybe next slide. Oh no, here I missed. This was a very important thing. And you have, the former, thank you so much. Sorry, Michael. This is Albert Stolz, which is very dear to the South Tyrolean audience. It was the portrait of his wife. And Francesco put the frame of the Tondodoni of Michelangelo Buonarroti around this picture. And this was really a highlight for the audience. So again, this emotional aspect that was really very important for the show. And next slide. Here you can see the female portraits in the next slide. And you have only one portrait who has an original frame, which is the portrait of the mother of Francesco, and she is a portrait like the portrait that we have on the left, which is the portrait of Jean-Dominique Ingres. So there were all these relationships displaying, but in my opinion, also thanks to this reframing, Francesco allowed us to discover multiple art histories. So framing is always, in my opinion, the exact opposite of this cancel culture. It's about revision and it's about inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Letizia. Hopefully everyone can see me now. Brilliant. At this stage, we're going to move on to discussion of some of those themes. And let me say outright that we've talked about both this particular show and some of the pieces on display, but as Letizia brought in towards the end, we've also had some discussion of Francesco's other work and other shows, especially over the last decade. At the same time, we've had all manner of much larger themes. So we started off with Salvatore asking whether it's possible to have a dialogue between the classical and contemporary at all. And then we had a discussion with Verity about race and hybridity and the very prominence of these themes, especially in North America. With Platt, we had that larger question of, I think the word you used was chrononormativity and the question of queering time. And with Letizia, we moved on to the larger question of framing and reframing antiquity, a theme very close to Verity's heart as it is to mine. I'm going to look at the questions and answers in just a minute, but while I do so, I want to put one of the first questions that Salvatore posed to Francesco and ask him about this possible tension that arises from a direct intervention with an archaeological work. Francesco, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm kind of scared of giving adequate answers, but please shoot.
So, Francesco, do you? I guess a classical archaeologist might say, is there a danger of intervening directly with an ancient sculpture when it comes to repainting it or applying paint? And with your Hadrian, the Gate of Hadrian, for example, and that would be an example. Can I ask you, what's your rationale in that kind of direct intervention, and how do you see your rationale as engaging with an earlier history of intervention with classical sculptures? After all, if we were talking in the late 18th century, we would think nothing of adding a limb to a Venus statue. If we were in 1506, we would think nothing of restoring the Laocoon, famously discovered. So can you talk a little bit about how you see that tradition of intervention and whether you see it as problematic in any way?
Well, I'll always I'll just give very always personal, almost emotional answer, because I think that you cover the scientific side brilliantly, and I can tell you how I feel when I do it. Correct. So it's the fruit of an urgency, but obviously it's something that creates within me a conflict. But then I consider that urgency and conflict are good things. Like if you feel compelled to do a certain gesture, but you are aware that that gesture can have a certain amount of danger and complexity and risk, I think probably you're making art in some ways. I like when he said queering up the past, because that's exactly what happened to me. I was embraced by that past. Then I went to London. Then I immersed myself into queer culture. And then I almost literally and physically went back to those sculptures and kind of queered them up. Technically speaking, the paint over those sculptures is removable. But saying that doesn't make me either a better artist, either a more politically correct person. I make that gesture and I take full responsibility for it. In the end, my answer is the following. These items have all been legally bought at auctions. There are hundreds. I have never bought or done any of those interventions on anything that could be said has a kind of artistic relevance, or that, let's say, could be legitimately exhibited in a museum for its unicity. So I feel I've acquired some traces, some kind of like leftovers of our past, and I just, as someone has said, I bridged them back to this, to our historical moment, and I take responsibility for that. Obviously, I'd like to underline that even if I had the financial means to do something like that on a piece that has a true historical relevance, I would never do it. That's not part of my statement. I hope the answer fulfills the question.
It does, very much so. Does anyone want to come back?
Yes, I'd like to comment on something else, actually, on what Patch did about, said about the historical amnesia about polygamy, which is a very interesting point, also because this amnesia was not just unconscious, it was very conscious. And may I read you a few lines from an article in 1837 in a British review, when in their polychrome buildings, the Greeks appear to have manifested a more licentious taste than that of the Arabian and Moorish architects, puerile in itself and diametrically opposed to the chaste simplicity of classical architecture. So either the Greeks indulged in much bad taste, and we have improved their architecture by purifying it, or else their modern imitators are very far indeed behind them, and we have yet much to learn. There is indeed one mode of getting rid of the dilemma, namely by running away from it altogether, taking no further notice of colors and proceeding as we have hitherto been accustomed to do, avoiding an uncomfortable disturbance of most comfortably settled notions. So I think that when Verity was making her points about challenging or destabilizing monumentality, I think that polychromy is one way of destabilizing monumentality. So it's one reason why it is very important, because the classical, the notion of classical, the classical notion of the classical is associated to a blank, to a totally white marble which never existed.
Which takes us, Salvatore, right back to your first question about whether we can ever have a dialogue with antiquity, or whether classical antiquity is always a construct of contemporary imaginations. I'd like to go back to that theme in just a minute, but questions are now coming through, and one of the first ones I'd like to ask is it takes us back to Verity's question about race. And the whole question of race, and this is one I'd like to ask you, Francesco, about in the context of how you see the racial connotations of classical art working in your own, in your own birth town of Brescia. And the particular question is: can modern characterizations of race be applied back to classical artistic representations of individuals? And is it ethical to do race featuring or not featuring in your work?
Can you repeat? The line went away when you said, is it ethical?
Is it? So the question is, can modern characterizations of race be applied back to classical artistic representations? And is it ethical to do so? So, but both the question of whether we can talk about race in the context of these ancient, of antiquity at large, and also the larger question of whether it's ethical to do so. So I guess about the relationship between modern ideas of race and antiquity.
I mean, it's a very complex question. For me, I'll try to simplify the answer, and I'll say anything we do now. The problem is not with what we do now. The problem is what we have done in the past. So when I see the sculpture of Stanford, and I'm a big fan of, or Cain the Wily, and I have been friends forever. Whenever I see this kind of appropriation or games or dialogues, I I terribly enjoy it, but I am ready to engage in a conversation with people that don't enjoy or don't subscribe to it. So personally, I don't have any. It's not that I don't have any issue with what is done now. I cannot have any issue with what is done now, because what is done now, it's there for us to be it's like a stone thrown to create a debate. So that's a good thing. I am actually, to finish my answer, the more we focus on what is being done now and the least we focus on what has been done in the past, I think is the best way to approach a cultural debate in general. I hope what I'm trying to say makes sense. Does it make sense?
It does make sense. So again, that image of a kind of cinematic stage set that can be reappropriated to whatever end one would like. Is that a fair summary, Francesco?
Yeah, but in general, I would say that this for me functions for even if they are not my academic fields, literature, sculpture, figurative art. If we focus on how artists are reacting today and what they are producing today, that is great. It's fantastic, because from every different branch there is a different reaction, there is a different reappropriation, there is a different approach. If we get obsessed with what has been done wrong in the past, probably we will not maybe go further. I prefer to focus on what my peers are doing than on Abraham Lincoln's mistake.
Verity, did you want to come back onto any of those issues? I know Patch wanted to come in, but did you want to say anything else in relation to that question of race and power?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate between the way that we study antiquity and think about the ancient past and how questions about race or ethnicity may be applicable there, and then the many appropriations of that past over the centuries and the way that they've been deployed toward, in certain manifestations of power, and how they are read in particular contexts by different groups. And there are many different stories to be told, and some of those are stories that people are wishing to revisit and undo at the moment. And when you're talking about monumentality in public spaces that are inherently politicized, it's impossible to get away from those questions, I think. But it's important that artists be able to take risks.
Yeah, well, can I answer?
Please, yeah.
I'm ready to take risk, and I am fascinated. I've learned recently that there are some professors. I'm not sure in which university in America, that not archaeologists. I think they are more historians that are reassessing the figures of Messalina and Agrippina, because they have been, so to say, unjustly depicted and historicized by the white male gaze of the Roman of Suetonius, let's say. Okay, well, I'm in total favor of that. I'm in total favor of anything that is somehow progressive. I don't know if that's the right way of calling it.
One of the things I think is really interesting that comes out of the conversation is the way in which the classical and debates about the classical and the appropriations of the classical take on different national characteristics according to the different national political agendas. And so it's very understandable, perhaps, that the state of play in North America and in the US is rather different from that of Italy. And I think that, you know, we could talk at much greater length about that too. Pat, I was aware before you wanted to come in and say something when the microphone wasn't working. Do you want to come back in now?
Oh, sure. Sorry, and the bar just didn't appear, so I couldn't do it. Yeah, I just thought it was so interesting to hear Francesco's point there. I mean, you know, one could look at Ai Weiwei, for example, right, and sort of painting Coca-Cola on Han Dynasty vases, right, or dropping them with like an actual sort of destructive act. So in a way, it's like Regal is like more present than ever, right? Sort of retaining the sanctity of historical value of monuments and sort of thinking about age value. I mean, in the context of this part of the question, you know, one thing that I'm still trying to sort of sort through, you know, with, you know, race being, I think, also a really sticky issue with, you know, polychromy too, right? With there have been several people who have been talking about, you know, the ways in which, you know, can polychromy, you know, can these polychrome reconstructions be sort of deployed in a kind of liberatory anti-racist mission, right, in scholarship? And, you know, it seems really tricky to me, because on the one hand, it is absolutely true. I think that, you know, with Winkelmann, we see the sort of the beginnings of the racialization of stone and skin color kind of happening, you know, together. On the other hand, you know, at least, you know, with polychromy, I worry in some sense about a kind of literalization and a kind of conflation between pictorial representation and political representation, or like of identity politics, right? And of you know, that making representation in the polychrome statues isn't necessarily the representation that we're looking for, right? And, you know, I mean, one thing that I've talked about with a friend is that, you know, there are polychrome figures who have blue pubic hair, right? Like it's just a really interesting case, I think, for the sort of like the sort of parameters and the limits of this kind of discourse. But I think it's yeah, it's one that I'm still working through, but I think it presents a unique set of challenges.
Thank you. I've got my eye on time. Francesco, did you want to come back to any of those points?
No, I think I can give a brief answer, but I think Professor Settis has somehow, with his genius quote, has somehow turned on the light. It's like this idea of bright white classicism has never existed, but has influenced taste and values in art and in culture and in aesthetics. I think that by unloading the rainbow of colors for the past, we are doing in some ways some sort of political act. Does it make sense? I don't know.
Absolutely, it does. Francesco, with that in mind, can I ask then one final question? You know, it's the question that Salvatore began with. Is it ever possible to have this dialogue?
You mean, but between
the classical and the contemporary? Is it ever possible to have a dialogue between the two, or is the dialogue always a fabrication of the modern artistic imagination or of modern scholarship?
No, I do believe for me it's beyond possible. For me, the dialogue is inevitable. This is my personal vision, but I have to share it. For me, the dialogue is inevitable, but not because I am Italian or because I have studied in a classical high school or read Suetonius or this and that, but because we have all been brought up in one way or another looking at those artifacts as somehow the beginning of some sort of civilization. So in one way or another, sometimes in an aggressive way, sometimes in a more dialectic way, I think maybe the word to use is not dialogue, but definitely it's something that goes in the field of unconscious. These archetypes are stuck with us, and we are just trying to deal with them in so many ways, and every ethnicity, every sexual orientation gives its own answer in different periods to that. So for me, it's beyond a dialogue. It's like a stigma that we deal with. So yes, I think I answered. I personally, as you used the word bridge when you were talking about my work, so I think I'm more of the bridging type. There are others that are more of the kind of, I'd like to remind, not certainly to Professor Settis, that whenever an emperor would fall from grace and would be either killed or kicked out or die, all his sculptures would happen to be like destroyed or like hammered, etc. Or as we know, the reason why there are such few bronzes is because the sculptures of certain important emperors in bronzes were just melted to do the new emperor. So we just navigate this history of archetypes, and every person, I think, is entitled to have its own reaction.
Absolutely. Thanks, Francesco. To give another metaphor, the idea of being married to the classical, to being married to the classical antiquity and the classical legacy, for better or for worse, maybe would be one way of putting it. I'm very aware of the time, and I know we have got more questions coming through, but I'm also aware that King's is very keen that we stick to time, and I'm already going to be in trouble for being 10 minutes over. So I think we had better say a huge thank you, first and foremost, to Francesco for joining us tonight from Sicily, but also to the rest of the panel, to Salvatore, to Verity, to Patrick, and to Letizia. It's been a discussion from which I've learned a great deal, and I'm hugely grateful again, as we all, to the Centre for Hellenic Studies at King's and to the Musei Brescia for all their help facilitating this discussion. This discussion, of course, is only itself a bridge to part of a larger conversation, and it's a conversation that I hope we will continue as time goes on. So thank you to everyone, and have a good evening or a good morning or a good afternoon wherever you are, and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you from me a lot.